Yes, Mohammed.
Yes, I want to be selfish. Now, I don't want to go global yet. So we have to take it one after the other. I want to take you back to Nigeria. I remember that when you were the minister, education minister, you tried within the limit of your power to put certain structures on ground, which were somehow not palatable to some people, and to some people it was all right. Now you are no longer there. How do you assess the system now? I know you know what's going on. What do you assess Nigeria to your system now? Vis-a-vis the crisis here and there, from universities to community schools and all that. I want you to give me an overview of what you think is beyond what's happening now.
Well, you know, I'm not going to, I'm going to answer the question in a way that takes not just Nigeria, but takes all the rest of the continent, because as you could see from the statements of a number of the ministers that have intervened so far during the conference, the factors limiting or constraining effective education delivery at all levels across the continent seem to be similar. So clearly, the important issue in embarking on bold and courageous reforms is #1 agenda item. A lot of people miss the boat on the issue of education and say, oh, it's just funding that is important. No. As I used to say when I was Minister of Education, if you fund a dysfunctional system or a dysfunctional sector very well, what you will have is not an effective sector or system or a functional sector or system. You will have a well-funded dysfunctionality. So you first of all get the system, get the sector right. So it requires the political will to embark on courageous reforms. Those reforms, as you rightly noted, would attract all kinds of criticisms from some of the vested interests that will be affected if those reforms work. But I think the fundamental vision of any reform must be that the gain of that reform should be for the poor. Because you see, the poor depend on government for most of their well-being. So for as long as government can make effective policies, then you give the poor the opportunity in life to be socially mobile. So once the reform would be positive impact on the poor in the medium to the longer term, it is worth fighting for. That's #1. So, you know, the embarking on bold, courageous policy reforms with the best of and the strongest of political commitment to them is key. And then, of course, is the idea that with the reforms need to be inclusive. So there are even people who would be critical of the reform, still allow them to have their voice. And for me, as minister, I didn't mind being criticized, because it was okay for people to criticize what they thought we were doing. You needed to think of all alternatives. The most important thing was for you to be able to argue on the basis of superiority of reasoning. If the other party's reasoning is superior to yours, then you need to give way. And, you know, because all you're looking for are solutions. So that approach is important across the continent, that there should be voice, adequate voice, and that the voice should be inclusive. It should be all constituencies. So in my set of education reforms when I was minister, for me it wasn't just about government and the voice of government and the agencies or the people running the education sector in government. It was about civil society. It was about private sector. I remember that civil society group called Sakefa in the country followed the education sector reforms that we were doing so much that even after I left, they continued to insist on some of those reforms. That's important. The private sector followed some of the reforms that we did so much that recently I was reading of a corporation that still is carrying on with the Adopt a School, and they have already done adoption of 25 schools that they are upgrading on the basis of their corporate social responsibility. And they have a target to do beyond 100 and or so of those schools. Now, that was inclusive. The issue in education, looking at the various levels of education, the issues in equality and quality assurance, means that you have to reform certain regulatory activities. You have to sort of look at the responsibility that government, government bureaucracy has for education. It needs to be setting the vision for what kind of education sector and system do we want to have. But in terms of regulating it, it might not be the ministry itself that can do that. The ministry can have, like in the case of the universities, it has the National Universities Commission. Then it needs to spend its effort at ensuring that the independence of that commission is assured and that they have the competency and integrity to be able to regulate university administration very, very well. And the issues in university autonomy have become important. So when you talk about university autonomy across the continent, it's key. But autonomy must come with commensurate responsibility. You don't say, I want autonomy, and then you are totally dependent on the government for everything, including to subsidize your own inefficiency in running the public university system. You can't afford that, because if government has very limited resources. If it subsidizes the inefficiency in administering any level of education, it does a disservice to the majority poor that will not have access to education. The issues in education finance were important for me as a Minister of Education. And it was to look at it from the perspective of saying that at the different levels of government, you need, government have, in the case of many federal structures, you see that it is a divided responsibility. So it's usually on the concurrent list. So the national government has responsibility, the state governments and the local governments have responsibilities. They have to discuss this well and to know how they can act in complementarity and get the synergies of coordinated action. Otherwise, you would have very diffuse kind of, quality outcomes. You wouldn't have a uniformity of outcomes across the country. So you might be building 3 societies if you're not careful. So how do you build a political consensus in terms of how the quality and standard of education should be across the country? These are issues. And in financing education, the various levels of government really need to discuss on how they would ensure that, as the minister from Singapore, Minister Taman, was saying, that the whole systemic efficiency, that you have very constrained resource environment. So how do you ensure that the expenditure for education is optimized and that every opportunity to maximize the return in form of many more number of people getting quality education? How do you ensure that? How do you ensure that you don't have bureaucracy that eats up most of the resources for education and then leaves you with little to nothing to invest in the capital, to put in the capital investments that are necessary for ensuring good education outcomes? These are all tough and difficult issues. So they are politically difficult. And so the idea that you would embark on very bold and radical reforms in the education sector and everybody would be clapping is a fallacy. Don't even think about it. But whatever is worth doing is worth doing well. So you push for it because the life of the nation is dependent on how well your education sector functions. Okay, so I hope that's fine.